So hi, my name is Akshay Aggarwal, and I am going to talk to you about the security landscape of blockchains. What I wanted to do really was to talk about some foundational issues with respect to blockchain. I'm going to be talking to you about some risk factors that blockchains face. We'll cover some use cases, some interesting use cases for blockchains, and essentially what is the value that they're trying to provide to people. And then finally, I'll present a framework for looking at risk for these technologies. All of these are essentially, my perspective on this is looking at a strategic view of blockchains from the perspective of a decision maker, both on a business perspective as well as someone who is looking to implement this technology. So I won't go too much into the weeds of what the blockchain itself is. So the way I like to think about it is everything but the math, right, or the protocols. But I'm not going to be covering that. There are a lot of speakers here today who will talk to you about what's under the kimono. So specifically for me, as Andrew mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of Deja Security, but I spend most of my time in the automation space where we're looking at automating security testing for protocols, right? So why exactly am I talking about blockchain? Perhaps it's because back in 2014, when no one was really looking at Bitcoin, we, along with a couple of co-collaborators, I wrote a paper on the security analysis of Bitcoin mining. I've also authored securing the enterprise blockchain research notes for people in investing groups. But I think my fundamental qualification to talk to you about blockchain is because my wife's here, so I don't think I should say this, but I've lost more Bitcoin than is reasonable for a human being to do, and mostly because I threw away old hard drives, and who hasn't done that? Right, so I was one of the early miners of Bitcoin, and I wish I knew what the price of Bitcoin would be today before I decided to upgrade machines in the past. Right, so I know some of you over here are nodding. I see that I have people who've gone through the same pains as I have. So how I like to start this conversation off is essentially looking at some numbers. Right? Looking at numbers that are relevant to the conversation today for me, and also relevant to set the stage for the conversations you'll have throughout the day with the rest of the speakers. So essentially, McKinsey looked at classifying the use of blockchains, and they found 64 use cases. And my analysis on this, along with a few experts that I've spoken to, we've been able to grow that into the 90s. So we think that around 90 odd use cases for blockchain that are immediately come up. 15% of banks in particular are looking to use blockchain by this particular year, according to IBM. But what's also more interesting is that the total market size for blockchain is expected to be around $20 billion in the next 5 years or so, or next 7 years or so. There have been 135 ICOs since 2014. Right, and they've collectively raised around $1.6 billion, right? And so that's a huge chunk of money that is essentially in an unregulated fundraising mechanism, right? And we'll actually hear about a successful ICO journey later on today. The other thing that was very interesting for me is the idea of scalability, right? And so essentially the Ethereum network, the analysis by a few people looks at the fact that it can manage around 13 to 15 transactions per second. And as I looked at Etherscan just this morning, 701,000 transactions happened on the Ethereum network yesterday. That was actually the highest total that's ever been. When I first made these slides, it was in the low 600s, and within the blink of an eye, we've already seen 100,000 more more transactions happening per day, right? And so scalability is a huge issue in the blockchain space, especially as we look to use those in blockchain technologies in enterprises. And then finally, one of the interesting metrics that I was looking at was that Seattle as a region is ranked 9 out of 10 of the top 10 areas where blockchain development is happening, according to Deloitte, right? And later on today, I'll have a conversation with Dr. Joseph Williams, who is with the state of Washington, and he will have some interesting ideas on how do we budge that higher, right? Or essentially lower, if you're looking at that perspective. So let's be honest, right? Blockchain and blockchain technologies, while they're emerging new technologies, they've already had significant security events happen to them, and there has been substantial loss as a result of those events. The interesting pieces for me in this were the one return in Bitcoin, which was an integer overflow attack that essentially created 184 billion Bitcoins. Wouldn't you like to have 184 billion Bitcoins just about right now? Even if the price was a fraction of what it was. So this happened before Bitcoin was really popular. There was a hard fork that solved this problem. It really didn't impact anyone significantly. Who hasn't been burned by Mt. Gox and the alleged transaction malleability that essentially evaporated $460 million of value from people. Other interesting areas for me have been the CoinDash ICO. Essentially, someone manipulated the address that you were supposed to send coins to and got away with $7 million in an ICO that I believe was looking to raise $13 million. So essentially half of your ICOs has now evaporated. And then finally, due to a two-factor authentication issue, Veritasium's Ether wallet lost $8 million, right? So these are all very, very tangible value losses, right? But the key aspect, if you look at it from my perspective, and the key takeaway is this: this is not just an attack on blockchain and blockchain technologies. The attack is essentially on how blockchain technologies are orchestrated, implemented, and operated, along with the foundational aspects of the blockchain itself. So these things together make up the attack surface for blockchain technologies, and are one of the fundamental ways by which I would see a real world attack actually taking place. And we'll talk a little bit about this and a framework of looking at that later in the talk. So let's talk about some foundational issues with blockchain. This portion of my conversation today is not a primer of how blockchain technologies work. It is merely illustrating some of the key aspects of blockchain technologies that are useful for us when we look at mapping risk. So as I looked at it, there were 5 key aspects of blockchain. I know that different people or different organizations may classify them a little differently, but fundamentally I found that there are 5 key aspects of blockchain. One is a distributed ledger database, where essentially each party has access to the entire database and its complete history. The second aspect is a decentralized and peer-to-peer communication. It means there's no central node that's governing communication between the nodes. So there's no one who is essentially being able to stop you from participating. That does change a little bit in the enterprise, especially when it's permissioned blockchains of some sort. So, but if you are a member of the blockchain, you have access to that communication. The third aspect is transparency with certain amount of pseudonymity. Now I will trip over that word. Pseudo-anonymity is what I'll go with, right? So communication occurs directly between. So every node has access to the entire auditable record set, right? And because of the fact that you can be pseudo-anonymous when you're creating those records, it offers some measure of anonymity, but it is definitely not complete anonymity. And in certain use cases, that anonymity is not desirable at all, right? The fourth aspect is irreversible records, in which you, as a member of the system, you should not have the ability to go back and alter something that's already been committed, right? So you or any other member should not have that ability, and so it becomes a record that can be taken into the future. And the fifth key aspect of this is all of this is essentially focused on computational logic that underpins this entire network. So you can programmatically resolve certain issues or have contracts and set up or set up reconciliations where you could not do that in previous systems. So these are some of the key aspects of blockchain. Right, and some of the foundational technology that pillars that it's built on is, again, decentralized and distributed ledger systems, public key or cryptography. There's a concept of presenting proof of work, or as we're trying to transition towards proof of stake, and I've seen other concepts like proof of membership being discussed as well. And of course, there are a plethora of technology that this particular blockchain is dependent on. Like, you can talk about Merkle trees, hash functions. I'm not going to list all of them, but just understand that there are definitely some foundational technologies that make up and allow this blockchains to work. The idea behind it is this, right? That foundational technologies are things you build on top of, right? And you assume are there, and in certain aspects assume are working the way they're intended to work. There's a certain amount of inherent risk with those foundational technologies that you have to take into account as you determine whether the use case and the implementation of that use case is suited to your risk management style. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But fundamentally, let's talk about why do people use blockchains and what is the wonder of blockchains, right? I was really excited last week as I was creating slides for this talk, because it's been very rare in security when I am putting my thoughts down to present, and while I am doing so, I'm also discovering new areas of thought for myself, and then also discovering that people have done even more work than brief amount of time that I was focused on something different. So this is really interesting for me. And so why I'm so interested in blockchain technologies is for two reasons. It's the idea that you can remove infinite reproducibility of digital assets and realize a value exchange, right? Essentially, what that means in simpler language is this. Back in the day when most of us were using Napster, right, and you had or you had a digital asset, a song, essentially, even if you by some mechanism happened to own, a non-restricted MP3 of that song, reproducibility of that and sharing it with all your friends was pretty darn simple to do, right? So digital assets had no real value that you can assign to them because of the fact that once you lost control of them, reproducibility decreased the value of them. And blockchains are definitely a mechanism by which you can retain value of digital assets, right? And that's one of the areas that's very interesting and exciting for me in particular. The other interesting thing aspect of blockchains that I love is its promise to eliminate the middleman, right? Again, I want to stress on the fact that it's a promise. It's not a realization at this point, right? And perhaps it may never be a realization because of additional considerations beyond the technology itself. But at least in certain use cases, it allows you to move beyond having a trusted entity that is governing or acting as a gatekeeper for communication and reconciliation. So what that does is this. It does 5 things that are interesting for me. It frees up capital flow, so you can essentially take capital investments that you would make in operational issues or in building a fundamental system, and you can now use that to do something different. In many cases, it will speed up a process because you don't have to have a trusted middleman in the middle. You can do things that are in an automatic manner. That also leads to lower transaction costs, and that's interesting. All the while, it promises to provide you with higher security. Again, being a hacker, I have to stress on the promises part, and it also enables certain aspect of trust, and whether that trust comes from identity management or other aspects. So those are 5 key areas that you would want to look at in terms of the benefit that you're deriving from blockchains. And I know that a number of people in the audience today are essentially leading either new ventures or new solutions that are looking at blockchain technologies. And I'd love to hear from you as to why you're investing or paying attention to blockchains and what's interesting for you in that space. So let's look at some of the use cases for blockchains. And again, part of the conversation that I was having with a number of blockchain experts, I talked to you about the fact that we came up with 90 odd use cases for blockchain. So we did a little bit of an analysis of the use cases, at least for the use cases we came up with. 40% of them were in the financial services space, and around 70% of them were focused on cost reduction in a process. Right. One of the future works that we're looking to do is to analyze which one of those 90 use cases we feel is immediately implementable versus what requires certain technology innovations to happen before they can be implemented. So some of those use cases that I'm really interested in, again, are cross-border B2B payment. That seems to be a place where a heavy amount of investment was being made, which is a little different than cross-border P2P, person-to-person payments. Other areas that were interesting are trade finance, escrow, basically getting rid of a middleman in some aspects. Initial coin offerings. We're going to hear about some ICOs, at least an ICO story during the conversation today. Smart contracts, which I know that Adam and his team have done a fair amount of, or have a fair amount of experience with. And then something that I'm working on right now is supply chain management. what happens in the enterprise when the enterprise looks to adopt blockchains. And so those are some of the use cases that are fairly interesting and almost immediately relevant and from my perspective. So my contribution to you today and my value to you today was essentially helping understand from a business decision maker's perspective, how do you understand and map the risk of blockchain technologies, right? And I've had a lot of conversations with people who are deep into the weeds with this, as well as organizations that are looking to make significant investments in this space, and everywhere in the middle. And based on those conversations, I created a risk criteria for looking at blockchains. I broke the risk criteria down onto 6 different criteria. The criteria essentially is legal and regulatory, because a large portion of the use cases around blockchains essentially are in legal and regulatory limbo. Obviously cryptocurrencies being the number one place that you can think of in that space. And so because the regulatory and legal aspects are unknown, that carries a huge amount of risk, because the way that regulations come down on it could change the material value of the implementation and what you're deriving from these things. The second is foundational. Foundational essentially means what risks are inherent to the blockchain itself, the concept of blockchains, the fundamental building blocks that I referred to earlier, and those implementations of those fundamental building blocks. Right? So very often when you're implementing a solution that utilizes blockchain technologies, you're going to build on top of those foundational elements. Foundational elements by their definition will not be something that most organizations will be responsible for. So by choosing the right foundational element, right, you also inherit the risks that are residual in that foundational choice, right? The third is technical implementation. Back in the slide that I presented, which talked about attacks that have worked on blockchains or blockchain technologies, a fair number of those have been the result of a technical implementation. How was the concept actually implemented, both from a code perspective, from a deployment perspective, and so on. And so you cannot divorce yourself from areas such as kosher application security practices, etc., for blockchain technologies as well. Operational integrity. So how are operations? How is the blockchain and the technology actually going to work? And then unique to blockchains is the idea of scalability, right? Because at some point, if you reach the scalability level of the foundational technology that you used, the value of that chain may actually be absolutely zero to you, right? So scalability is a fundamental limiter currently for blockchains, and I know maybe Navneet will have something different to tell us about the scalability aspects of blockchain, and I'm looking forward to his conversations with him. And then finally, future-proofing, right? This is an emerging technology. Pretty much, when I think of things that have come up like Tezos or other interesting innovations in this space in terms of governance and other aspects, what you find is that at some point each foundational element and implementations on that is going to reach a limit, and when that limit is reached, you have to decide either to essentially hack it so that it does something different, or you need to understand how to migrate from it, right? And so future-proofing yourself, especially if you're building a business process, is actually very important in this particular emerging technologies, because I don't know who the winners are going to, or what fundamentals are going to win, and I strongly suspect that most of you are also wondering what foundational technologies will actually emerge winners in this space. right? So with this risk criteria in mind, what I did was I sat down with a few very smart people, and we had conversations around what each of those use cases, how they would hold up to those criteria, and I created a heat map for you guys, which I'll share with you. So let's look at ICOs. Just by a show of hands, how many people over here are familiar with what an ICO is? Pretty much. Huh? How many people have invested in an ICO? Excellent, excellent. I knew that there was going to be at least one person here who would raise their hands. So essentially for ICOs, the heat map, ICOs are initial coin offerings, which are unregulated, and at least Wikipedia defines them, or Investopedia defines them as controversial means of crowdfunding. Not my emphasis. But the heat map is fairly straightforward. Red is where my panel of experts thought that the risk was significantly high and was unmitigated at this point. Yellow is where the risk is high, but there are some mitigations in place. Green is where the risk is more or less managed, and white is where we don't know what the risk in the future is going to be. So it's unknown, or we could not agree to what the risk would end up being. So clearly in ICO, just because of the regulatory framework associated with it, there's a risk associated with it. So just yesterday, the SEC, I believe, has filed a suit against Plex Corp for their ICO, which was promising an absurdly high rate of investment return within a very, very small period of time, and if my memory serves me correctly, it was on the order of around 1,300% return within a month or a couple of months, and they managed to raise several millions of dollars. So so that just essentially is the kind of money that people are playing with. There is some foundational risk associated with it. There's nothing that you can do. It's based on the foundational elements that you decide to focus on. But we feel, because the foundational elements for a lot of technologies are looked at by people like some of the people in this room, those risks are mitigated by having security experts involved in that conversation. The technical implementation for ICOs does have certain amount of risk, but the common opinion essentially was that because of some of the short-lived nature of some of the ICO offerings, technical implementation had also some mitigating factors in it. The operational integrity of those in the long term is something that has essentially been attacked, as I pointed out to you in the CoinDash example. And then scalability is not a significant risk, and again, as I mentioned, future-proofing. There was no consensus on whether ICOs are future-proof or not. Moving on to smart contracts. Smart contracts, for those who are not familiar with them, are essentially self-executing contracts with the term of agreement between the buyers and the sellers is directly written into lines of code, and with certain triggers, those contracts are executed and value can pass between two entities. That's the promise of smart contracts. So from a legal and regulatory perspective, they're definitely on a somewhat of a better footing than ICOs are. They share some same basic foundational issues with security, but where the real risk lies in this space is technical implementation, operational integrity. The scalability of those contracts is actually a big issue, because that is where, especially when you use them in an enterprise setting, that massive adoptability can actually hamper the effectiveness of that blockchain itself. And then future-proofing is also a higher amount of risk over here, because you do need contracts, especially contracts that live for a longer period of time to be able to withstand the temporal nature of some of the aspects of what blockchain specifies for you. So that's essentially a heat map for this. Cryptocurrency, I don't think there's nothing new over here. It probably should have been just read all the way across, right? We did have a little bit of a conversation about, hey, that some of the foundational risks around Bitcoin and Ether and Ethereum and stuff have been looked at a little bit. So we have a little higher amount of resilience or trust in that space. But you could make an argument for me to move it to red, and I wouldn't have much to really stand on. So let's not debate that too much. But I don't think anybody is surprised with the fact that there's just red all the way around, specifically in the legal and regulatory space. An interesting conversation that I was having, a perspective that I did not have till day before yesterday, was what if your virtual currency, your Bitcoin, is essentially classified as property as opposed to currency, right? What happens to your tax bill at that point, right? And from what I was led to believe, that in certain jurisdictions that could mean that you're paying out real money chasing virtual currency because of the property nature of that tax. I'm not a lawyer, so I would certainly would be interested to see if any jurisdiction does map that as property instead of currency. And then finally, from an enterprise perspective, I looked at this from an enterprise perspective, and my assumptions with the enterprise are this, right? That the enterprise blockchain will be distributed, it will be permissioned, so it's not public, in which it's not like you and I can go in and join an enterprise. You have to be permissioned into that enterprise, and you may not have the entire set of permissions so every node is not equal in that particular case, and essentially they're secure in a limited manner and somewhat secure also because you can essentially isolate them. So the risk over here specifically is from the technical implementation and the operational integrity of those systems. The legal and regulatory risks are lower. The foundational risks are also lower from our perspective, because essentially our assumption in this case is that enterprise blockchains have better resilience because they can choose to move to a different foundational element, given how often or transitions within enterprise software space actually happen. So better resilience than the rest of the systems. So finally, what I wanted to do was have a little bit of a peek into the future, right? And my peek into the future is some predictions about where blockchain technologies are going, right? So I believe that blockchain technologies are essentially just entering out of the dark ages where implementations were focused more on the Bitcoin aspects into essentially a place that's hyped, and a lot of use cases are being analyzed, and within 5 years or so will actually reach their full potential and maturity. I anticipate that implementation of proof of stake or proof of membership architectures is imminent. I know that an Ethereum network, Casper, and some of the other protocols or other architectures have been suggested. Which one of those would actually work out? My guess is as good as your guess is probably better than mine. I do feel that we are that within the next 3 years or so we will see massively scalable blockchains. We anticipate that 20 to 30 enterprise use cases will be demonstrably viably accepted, and that we will actually have some solutions around them. We also feel that there will be more regulatory and legal and regulatory frameworks around blockchains as well. So legal and regulatory frameworks actually come in two different flavors. One is legal and regulatory frameworks that nation states or governments will create. The second regulatory framework or governance framework that we're looking at is what blockchains themselves employ, right? So, so for example, the way that Bitcoin governs itself is different than the way Ethereum governs itself, which is different than what Destiny and some of the other newer systems are looking to govern themselves. So I actually see this as two separate problems, and I do see that there will be some positive movement in that space as well. But most importantly, I do predict that there will be some more hard forks in your future. You'll see a lot of hard forks coming very, very soon. And the reason why you're going to see some hard forks is essentially because of this exercise that we call the evil thoughts of the future. It's a term that I borrowed from my good friend Adam Chickeri, and something that Adam is famous for doing something called the evil thoughts of the day. And so we sat down and did an exercise saying, hey, what's in the future of hacks in the blockchain space? And some of those things that we see are coming by. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but my favorites in this are the imperfect audit trail. Because while blockchain will enable certain audit steps to happen and some for reconciliation to happen automatically, we've already started seeing steps in which people are missing things, and they have a very high resilience on that audit trail, where what happens in a virtual audit is not the same thing as that happens in the physical world, right? Other things that are interesting for me is I'm already starting to see some aspects of optimizing blockchains, so making predictive commits. We expect something to happen, so we predict it to happen, and then to speed up the process, make a short commit. And so timing issues are going to be interesting at some level when you move away from the core nature of blockchains and start introducing some amount of predictability in them. I also really wanted to see what happens when a really popular blockchain technology starts losing people, and then and suddenly essentially becomes a ghost town at some point of time, because resilience to the 51% attacks and other aspects can go down very quickly in certain scenarios like that. And so if future proofing is a critical component of those blockchains, but you suddenly have a quick dip in users, there are ways in which some attacks can happen. And I do predict that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see some of these nefarious ideas actually come out and be implemented. With that, I will be happy to take some questions.
Yes. Can you cast a little more light on the use case of supply chain management using blockchain? So specifically, what would the business rules for that application look like?
So essentially, I mean, what someone is essentially trying to do with supply chain is be able to audit what happened to each component along the way of its supply chain. So if you're specifically with respect to digital assets, that's great, because the digital asset itself can be tagged while the audit log itself is being created. So if I want to not have a situation where someone is introducing rogue code into my application, as has happened in some of the Android in some of the Android apps, that could be one of the technologies can be leveraged, in which you know exactly where each piece of code came from. At least, it doesn't talk about the functionality of those pieces, but at least it talks about the origin of those pieces and what the changes associated with them was. So you can have a certain amount of resilience with respect to what you're actually deploying, right? When your supply chain is about a physical product, in that case, I think that's a tougher case to solve, right? Because as I mentioned, what the digital record says versus what's physically happens in the physical world may actually be two different things, right? And so I know that there are a lot of people or a lot of firms, even in the Seattle area, that are working on that particular problem set, right?
I have a question.
Sure.
So for all the use cases that you outlined, it seems like a lot of the talk is focused on macro scale, scalability issues. Were any of those use cases micro scale, something that's specific to an organization or specific to a platform within the organization?
So the question really is that a lot of the use cases we were talking about were macro scale, and are there any examples of things that are micro scale specific to an organization itself? So I'd actually say that supply chain is it can be either macro or it can be micro, right? It really depends on the business process that you are supporting in itself, right? It also depends on your on the design criteria for what or the business goals that you're trying to accomplish, right? So I certainly see that there are going to be and already are executions of blockchain technologies in a very limited manner, right? For example, if you want to consider micro transactions in some aspects, or reconciliation between nodal banks, right? Those could be considered more micro transactions, in which it's between a group of known entities but at a very small level. So, excellent. So, thank you very much. And if if you're interested in a copy of these slides at this point, if you send me an email right now, my out of office message should give you access to a link to these slides, as well as just a few interesting research papers that I thought were interesting for people to read. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay.